Rain drummed on the eaves of my house in Pearland for the third day in a row. They say it's atypical for July, but I know better. 36 years in meteorology has taught me one thing: nature doesn't recognize the typical. Neither do people. I'm sitting in my shabby chair by the window, watching the droplets make fanciful patterns on the glass. Mabel loved days like this. She called them memory days and made a special tea with cinnamon and cloves. It's been 5 years since she's been gone, and I still make 2 cups out of habit. 74 years. Funny how time turns us into strangers in our own bodies. I look in the mirror this morning and don't recognize this gray-haired old man with deep wrinkles. Inside, I'm still the same burl rummage who once climbed to the roofs of weather stations to fix equipment and could predict thunderstorms by the smell of the air. The phone vibrates on the table. Quentin. My 39-year-old son calls rarely, usually when he runs out of money before payday. The last time was 3 weeks ago, something to do with a mortgage on a new car. As a real estate appraiser, he makes good money, but the money is slipping through his fingers. I answered after the 5th dial tone. "Dad, do you remember about dinner tonight?" His voice sounded unaccustomedly cheerful. I honestly didn't remember any dinner, but I didn't admit it. They'd say I had senile dementia, like the last time I'd forgotten my grandson's birthday. True, I wasn't notified then, but who's going to know? "Of course I remember," I lied. "And niece's, 7 o'clock at night." 6:30, Dad," Quentin corrected with a hint of annoyance. "Don't be late. She has big news." Annis always has big news. My oldest daughter, 36 years old, has the amazing ability to turn every event in her life into the center of the universe. Last time, the big news was that she changed her car to a more upscale one. Before that, it was that she signed up for a French course, which she dropped after 2 weeks. After the call, I went upstairs to change. My closet is modest: a few shirts, a pair of pants, 2 jackets. Mabel always made sure I looked neat, and even after she left, I try to keep up that tradition. I chose the navy blue jacket she gave me for our last anniversary. Anissa's house is in an upscale neighborhood in Pearland. It's 2 stories high with an immaculate lawn and an ornamental pond. All these excesses are paid for with money from her second husband, a successful lawyer who couldn't stand her temper and ran away after 3 years of marriage. The payoff, however, was generous. As I pulled up to my daughter's house, I noticed several unfamiliar cars, so there would be more than just children and grandchildren. Sighing, I prepared myself for an evening of fake smiles and superficial conversations. The door was opened by my youngest daughter, Edra. 32 years old, the most sensible of my children, an accountant by trade. The only one who doesn't ask me for money, doesn't call me either. "Hi, Dad." She hugged me awkwardly, like she was hugging a mannequin. "You're just in time. Everyone's already here." The whole family was gathered in the living room. Quentin and his wife Darlene and their 12-year-old twins, Edra, and of course, the lady of the house, Anise. Sitting next to her was an unfamiliar man in his mid-40s, with a neat beard and an expensive-looking suit. "There's Papa!" Annis exclaimed with exaggerated joy. "Now we can begin." I nodded silently and sat down in the chair by the fireplace. The twins, my grandchildren, didn't even get off their phones to say hello. Times are changing. In my day, kids would have been sent to their room without dinner for this behavior. "Beryl, I'd like you to meet Tristan Hoffett." Annis placed a hand on the bearded man's shoulder. "My fiancé." So that's what this is all about. A third marriage on the horizon. I nodded to Tristan, who stood up and extended his hand to me. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, sir. Annis has told me a lot about you." I wondered what exactly. That I'm a miser who sits on a pile of money, or that I'm an old man out of his mind who's nothing but trouble? I shook his hand, noting the firm handshake and the expensive watch on his wrist. "Hopefully, at least something good," I replied with a strained smile. Dinner passed in a tense atmosphere as usual. Annis talked about her job as a receptionist at the dental clinic. Quentin complained about the real estate market, and Edra was mostly silent. The grandchildren never broke away from their gadgets except to eat. Tristan turned out to own a small print shop that, he said, prints for some of the most prestigious companies in town. So, Tristan and I have an important announcement. Annis stood up, raising her wine glass. We've set a wedding date for September 15th, and it won't just be a wedding but a true celebration of love. Tristan smiled and rose with his glass as well. Quentin nodded approvingly. Darlene clapped her hands enthusiastically. Even Edra faked a smile. I silently sipped from my glass. We're renting Rosewood Manor, Anise continued, the best wedding venue in the state. There will be live music, a buffet by a Michelin-starred chef, and, of course, flowers from the most prestigious greenhouse. I cringed involuntarily, imagining how much it would cost. Tristan, noticing my expression, tensed a little. Dinner ended around 9 in the evening. Quentin and his family were the first to leave, citing that the kids had school tomorrow, even though it was summer. Edra didn't stay long either, explaining that she had to get up early for work. I was about to leave when Anise asked me to stay late. "Daddy, we need to talk privately," she said as she walked Edra to the door. We sat down in the living room. Tristan joined us, nervously stroking his beard. "Dad, you know how important a wedding is to a woman," Anise began in the sweet voice she used whenever she was about to beg for something. "It should be the happiest day of my life." For the third time, I couldn't resist. Annis ignored my retort. "Tristan and I have calculated all the expenses. It's quite a significant amount of money." "How much?" I asked bluntly. $120,000, she replied, looking me straight in the eye. I nearly choked. Dollars. In one day. "Dad, it's not just a day. It's the start of a new life. And besides, that's a perfectly reasonable amount for such an event. Some people spend $200,000. What does that have to do with me?" Even though I already knew the answer. Annis took a deep breath. "We want you to pay for the wedding. In full." I was silent, mulling over her words. I hadn't made much money during my career as a meteorologist, but I'd always lived frugally and invested wisely. After I retired, I sold our large family home and moved into a modest dwelling and invested the proceeds as well. I did have savings, but I wasn't about to spend it on my daughter's third wedding, which would likely end up like the previous ones. "No," I said simply. Anise's face changed instantly. The sweet smile disappeared. Her eyes narrowed. "What does no mean?" "It means I'm not paying for your wedding. You're a grown woman, Annis. You're 36 years old. You have a job, a house. If you want a lavish wedding, pay for it yourself." "But you have money!" Her voice went up an octave. "Everyone knows you're saving up. And for what? You're not going to spend that money on anything worthwhile anyway." "It's my money, and I decide what I spend it on." Tristan squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. "Maybe we could find a compromise. If not the whole amount, at least some of it." "No," I repeated firmly. "I already gave Annis the money for the first wedding. She paid for the second one through her divorce. Let her finance the third one on her own." Annis jumped to her feet. "You've always been like this. Stingy, stale, selfish. Mom would never have turned me down." "Leave your mother out of this." My voice grew colder. "She'd be the first one to tell you it's time to grow up." "Oh, you just hate to see me happy," Annis shouted. "You always have. You help Quentin all the time, but you never help me. I've helped you many times and you know it. Pennies. You gave me pennies when you have millions in the bank." I shook my head. Her idea of my financial situation was far from reality, but I wasn't going to dissuade her. "This conversation is over. I'm not paying for your wedding." I stood up and headed for the exit. Anise blocked my path. "You know what? You're going to regret this. I'm going to get that money whether you want it or not." "Is that a threat?" I asked calmly. It's a promise, she flashed her eyes. I have connections. I'll sue you and prove you promised to pay for the wedding. And if that doesn't work, I'll prove you're incapacitated and in need of guardianship. Tristan turned pale. Annis, maybe you shouldn't— Shut up! She snapped at her fiancé, who immediately fell silent, then turned to me again. Last chance, Dad. Either you give the money nicely or we'll meet in court. I looked at my daughter, a beautiful, confident woman, so similar outwardly to her mother and so different from her inwardly. Where had I gone wrong? When did she become like this? Or had she always been like this and I just didn't want to see it? Do what you want, I said and walked around her, heading for the door. You're going to regret this, she shouted after me. I swear you'll regret it. I walked out into the rain, which still hadn't stopped. I got in my car and just sat there for a few minutes, listening to the drops drumming on the roof. A strange calmness swept over me. Maybe this conflict had been brewing for years. Maybe it was inevitable. On the way home, I thought about Mabel. What would she say now? Maybe she'd rebuke me for being tough, or maybe she'd be supportive. We'll never know. At home, I did something I rarely did. I pulled out an old photo album. Here's Annis at 5 years old, with the doll we gave her for Christmas. Here she is graduating from high school. And here's her first wedding. Me walking her down the aisle, proud and touched. How things have changed. The phone rang around 11 o'clock at night. Quentin's number. What have you done? Without greeting, he began. Annis is hysterical. She wanted me to pay for her wedding. I refused, I replied simply. 120,000 is a lot, but you could have given something. It's small things to you. And for you, would you give your sister that kind of money? Quentin blanched. That's different. I have a family, children. And I don't? Dad, you don't understand. She's serious. She's already talked to a lawyer. Let her talk to whoever she wants. You're making a mistake, Quentin sighed. A big mistake. After the conversation, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The rain had finally stopped, and the full moon was peeking through the window. I thought about the fact that I had seen many storms in my 74 years of life, both in the sky and in human relationships. But for this storm, I was prepared. If Annis wants a war, she'll get it. A week had passed since the fight with Annis. I received no calls from her or Quentin, only Edra sent a short message. Hope you're doing well, Dad. No question mark, mind you. A statement, not a concern. The morning was surprisingly clear. The sun was shining through the kitchen window, illuminating the yellowed pages of the weather journal I was rereading for the third time. Old habits are hard to eradicate. I still check the barometer every morning and write the readings in my notebook, even though no one needs them but me. The doorbell rang, interrupting my musings. Lorelei Tannock, my neighbor to my left, stood on the doorstep. In her hand, she held a basket of blueberries. Good morning, Burl. Pick some from the garden, thought I'd share. She smiled, and the wrinkles around her eyes deepened. At 69, Lorelei retained a vivacity and energy that many younger people would envy. Thank you, Lorelei. Come in. I was just about to make tea. Lorelei is one of the few people I really feel comfortable with. A former high school English literature teacher, a widow like me. We met 5 years ago, shortly after Mabel's death when I moved to this quiet neighborhood in Pearland. She brought me a cake and offered to help me unpack. Since then, we've had tea regularly and discussed books, the weather, and occasionally our children. You look preoccupied, she remarked as she sat down at the kitchen table. Is something wrong? I sighed and told her about the visit to Annis, her demand to pay for the wedding, and her threats of legal action. 120,000 for a wedding. Lorelei shook her head. That's insane. My daughter spent 7,000 on her wedding and everyone was happy. It's not even about the amount. I set a cup of tea in front of her. It's that she thinks it's her right to demand money from me, as if I only exist to fund her whims. Have you always been generous with the kids? I grinned bitterly. More than that. For Quentin, I helped with the down payment on the house. It was $50,000. Annis I paid for her first wedding in full, $35,000, and that was in 2009. To Edra, I paid for her college education and then gave her money to start an accounting firm, which she closed a year later. Lorelei listened silently, stirring her tea. You know what the most frustrating part is? I continued. It's not that they're always asking for money. It's that they don't appreciate it. No gratitude, no respect, just the perpetual demands and complaints that I'm not giving enough. Children often take parental help for granted, Lorelei said thoughtfully. My oldest does, too, but threatening to sue is a bit much. I nodded. Anise has always been stubborn. If she gets something in her head, she'll go all the way, even if that end is breaking up with her own father. So what are you going to do? I shrugged. Wait it out. Maybe she'll cool down and come to her senses. Maybe she won't. Either way, I'm not going to give in to blackmail. We moved on to discussing the new novel Lorelei had recently read, but my thoughts kept returning to the conversation with Annis. Something told me that this conflict would not be resolved so easily. After Lorelei left, I decided to take a walk to the park. The day was warm, but not hot perfect for a leisurely stroll. Evergreen Park was only a 15-minute walk from my house, and I often spent time there watching the birds and the changing weather. Settling down on my favorite bench under an old oak tree, I pulled a tattered notebook and pencil from my pocket. The habit of making notes about the weather had stayed with me since my professional days. 15th of July, 14 hours and 30 minutes. Clear, light westerly wind, about 24 degrees. Barrel rummage? I looked up. Standing before me was Chloe Piddock, an old acquaintance, Quentin's neighbor. A woman of about 65, with dyed bright red hair and an unchanging handbag from some designer whose name I could never remember. Hello, Chloe. I nodded politely, though I inwardly tensed. Chloe was a notorious gossip. How are you feeling? She asked with feigned concern. Quentin said you've been having memory problems. I straightened up. I'm perfectly fine, thank you. Oh, of course you are. She laughed nervously. It's just that Quentin seemed so concerned. Said you'd become forgetful. Sometimes you don't recognize your relatives. That's absolutely not true. I felt myself boiling over. I don't have any memory problems. Of course. She patted my hand with the look of someone talking to a child. Just know that we're all supporting your family during this difficult time. It must not be easy for them to deal with your condition. Without waiting for my response, Chloe wished me a good day and strode off down the park path, already pulling out her phone, no doubt to share more gossip. I sat there, clenching my fists with impotent rage. So this is what my kids are doing, spreading rumors about my incapacity, setting the stage to take control of my finances away from me. When I got home, I found an envelope in my mailbox from a local law firm, Baxter, Hyde and Associates. Inside was an official paper, a subpoena. Anise Rummage had filed a lawsuit against Burrell Rummage to enforce an oral contract. The statement of claim claimed that I had allegedly promised to pay her wedding expenses in the amount of $120,000, and now I was reneging on my word. The hearing was set for August 10th, less than a month away. I read the document 3 times, not believing my eyes. She'd really done it. My own daughter had sued me. The next morning, I called the law firm listed on the paperwork as representing Annis and asked to be connected to the attorney handling the case. He turned out to be one Chase Weber, who sounded young and opinionated. Mr. Rummage, I'm representing your daughter in this case, he began in a formal tone. I hope we can settle this matter without undue stress for all parties. What kind of settlement are you proposing? I asked bluntly. Miss Rummage is willing to make concessions. Instead of the full $120,000, she will settle for $90,000, subject to immediate payment. That's not a concession, Mr. Weber. It's extortion. I never promised to pay for my daughter's wedding. We have witnesses ready to testify to the contrary." His voice grew harsher. "Your son Quentin and Miss Rummage's fiancé, Mr. Hoffett, will testify under oath that you made such a promise during a family dinner." I felt a chill run down my back. They're willing to perjure themselves in court. My own family. "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, "if we don't come to an agreement, Miss Rummage will be forced to raise the issue of your capacity. We have testimony from neighbors and acquaintances about your deteriorating mental state. In that case, the court may appoint a guardian to manage your finances." Is that a threat? My voice sounded calm, though things were boiling inside. "It's a reality, Mr. Rummage. Think about the offer. You have 48 hours. He hung up and I remained seated, clutching the phone tightly. Dozens of thoughts raced through my mind. They had thought of everything. If I didn't give the money for the wedding, they'd try to prove I was incapacitated and take control of all my funds away from me. And with enough perjured witnesses, they can do that. I dialed Edra's number. Of all my children, she was the least involved in this story, and perhaps she still had a conscience left in her. "Dad? Is something wrong?" Her voice sounded wary. "Do you know your sister is suing me?" A pause. "Yes, she did," she said. "And what do you think of that?" Pause again, longer. "I think it's a family matter worth settling out of court. She wants $90,000 for the wedding, Edra, or they'll seek to have me declared incapacitated." "I know," her voice grew quieter. "Quentin has already asked me to support their testimony about your condition." My heart skipped a beat. "And what did you say?" "I said I wouldn't get involved. But I won't help you either, Dad. This is your and Annis's war. I want to stay out of it." After talking to Edra, I sat staring out the window for a long time. The clouds were closing in. A storm was coming. I had to make a decision, and fast. An hour later, I was in the office of attorney Oliver Coude. Elderly, with shrewd eyes behind thick glasses, he had a reputation as a tough but honest lawyer. I told him the whole situation without omitting details. "They're serious," Coate remarked after studying the subpoena, "and they have a plan. What's your advice?" He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Rummage, I must first ask, was there actually a promise to pay for my daughter's wedding?" "No. Categorically no." "Good. Now, regarding your capacity, do you have any diagnosed cognitive impairments? Problems with memory, with decision-making?" "None. I have an annual physical. The last one was 3 months ago. The doctor hasn't noted any mental health issues." Coude nodded. "That's good. We can request a medical examination to refute their claims. But most importantly, we need witnesses to attest to your capacity and lack of promises about the wedding." I thought of Lorelei. She could attest to my sanity, but she only knows about the wedding from my words. "One more question," Coude continued. "You mentioned that you helped the children financially. Is there any documentation to support those payments?" "Yes, I've kept receipts, account statements. I've always been pedantic about finances." "Good. This can help us show that you're not refusing to help children on principle, but that you have the right to choose how you manage your funds." We talked for another hour or so, discussing defense strategy. Before I left, I asked the question that worried me the most. What if they win? What if the court finds me incompetent? Coate looked me straight in the eye. "Then you'll lose control of your finances. The court will appoint a guardian, most likely one of your children. They'll be able to manage your money, ostensibly in your best interest." "You mean they'll have access to all my savings?" "Exactly. And given that they've already shown a willingness to go to extreme lengths for money—" He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. My kids could completely bankrupt me, and legally. "There's another option," Coate said after a pause. "We can file a counterclaim." "On what grounds?" "Slander, emotional abuse, attempted fraud. If we have evidence that they're intentionally spreading false information about your mental state in order to gain control of your finances, that's a serious charge. I wondered. A countersuit would mean a complete break with the kids. But on the other hand, weren't they the first to cross that line? Do you need time to think? Cootie asked, seeing my hesitation. No, I shook my head. Prepare a countersuit. If they want war, they'll get it. A thunderstorm broke as I was leaving the building. Large raindrops pounded the sidewalk and thunder rumbled in the distance. Pulling up the collar of my jacket, I hurried to my car, feeling strangely relieved. The decision had been made. Now I had to gather evidence and prepare for battle. On the way home, I stopped by the bank and requested statements from all accounts for the past 5 years. I needed to document every instance of helping children, every gift, every loan. I was especially interested in transactions over the past year when I had been sick with pneumonia and was particularly vulnerable. The bank teller, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard, raised his eyebrows when he saw the amount of information requested, but did not ask any questions. 40 minutes later, I had a thick folder of statements in my hands. In the evening, I spread the documents on the table and began to study them methodically. Quentin had $50,000 for a down payment on a house 3 years ago. To him, $12,000 for a new car last year. Anise, $35,000 for her first wedding. Another $20,000 for home repairs after the divorce. Edra, $48,000 for education. Another $30,000 for starting a business. Separately, I highlighted the strange transactions of the last year. In February, when I was in the hospital with bilateral pneumonia, $15,000 had been withdrawn from my account. I didn't remember giving anyone an order for this transaction. In March, when I was still recovering at home, another $10,000. April, $8,000. Something didn't add up. I certainly didn't authorize these withdrawals. The only explanation is that someone used the power of attorney I signed before I was hospitalized. The power of attorney was made out to Anise and Quentin so they could pay my bills while I was incapacitated. I made copies of all the documents and put them in a separate folder for Coit. Then I called Lorelei. "You won't believe what's going on," I said when she answered. I told her about the subpoena, the meeting with the lawyer, and the strange transactions I'd discovered. "It's horrible." I could hear the genuine outrage in her voice. "How can they do this to their own father?" "Money changes people, Lorelei. Or maybe it just shows their true colors." "What are you going to do?" "Fight it. I'm filing a countersuit, and I need your help. Could you be a witness, confirm that I'm of sound mind and good judgment?" "Sure," she answered without hesitation. "Just tell me when and where." After talking to Lorelei, I felt a surge of energy. Yes, my own children have betrayed me. Yes, they are willing to lie and manipulate to get their hands on my money. But I would not give up without a fight. The next day, I took the paperwork to Coit and formally instructed him to prepare a countersuit. He scrutinized the bank statements, especially interested in the transactions during the period of my illness. "This is serious, Mr. Rummage," he said, setting the papers aside. "If they really did misuse your power of attorney, it could qualify as financial abuse of an elderly person, a criminal offense." "I don't want my kids to end up in jail," I hastened to say. "I just want them to leave me alone." "I understand, but the judge needs to see the full picture of what we're dealing with. This isn't just a family squabble over wedding expenses. This is a systematic attempt to take over your funds." Cootie began preparing documents for the countersuit, and I returned home with a heavy heart. Despite my determination to fight, the thought of a public confrontation with my own children hurt. What would friends say, neighbors? What would Mabel say if she saw what our family had become? That evening, the phone rang. Quentin's number. "Anise said you hired a lawyer," he began without greeting. "What was I supposed to do? My daughter is suing me." "You could just give her the money and all this would stop," irritation sounded in his voice. "Why are you being so stubborn? Are you feeling sorry for yourself?" It's not about the money, Quentin. It's about principle. I didn't promise to pay for Annis's wedding, and I'm not going to give in to blackmail. Blackmail, he snorted. You're being dramatic. She just wants to have a nice wedding and you refuse to help out of spite. What about the $33,000 you and Annis took out of my account while I was sick? A long pause. That was an emergency expense, for your own good. 33,000 emergency expenses, and why haven't I seen a single check, not a single acknowledgement? Look, Dad, his tone changed to conciliatory. Let's keep it simple. You just give Annis the money for the wedding. She drops the lawsuit, and we all become one happy family again. And if I refuse? Then you'll have to deal with the consequences. Annis is serious. She has a good lawyer, and she's not alone. I'm backing her. Are you willing to perjure yourself in court? Claim that I promised to pay for the wedding even though you know it's not true. I'll do what I have to do to protect my family. Protect it from whom, Quentin? From me? From your father who has spent his entire life taking care of you. He didn't answer, so I continued. You know what the saddest part is? I'm not even surprised. I've watched you and Annis manipulate and use people for years. I just didn't think the day would come when you'd turn it against me. Is that your final answer? He asked coldly. Yes, I'm not giving money for the wedding. And what's more, I'm countersuing you for financial abuse and slander. I'll see you in court, son. I hung up the phone, feeling a strange mixture of bitterness and determination. The way back was cut off. Now all that was left was to go forward, into a battle I never wanted to fight, but which I could no longer avoid. With each day that brought us closer to the trial, I plunged deeper into my preparations. Oliver Coote had advised me to gather as much documentation as possible to prove my financial support of the children over the years. This was to demonstrate to the court that I was not a stingy, heartless old man, but a caring father who had just decided to finally set boundaries. In the morning, I pulled old boxes of papers out of the pantry. Mabel had always teased me about my habit of hoarding every receipt, every bill, every contract. When you die, Beryl, the kids will have to hire a truck to haul all your papers away, she used to say with a smile. But right now, that pedantry might have saved me. I organized the papers by year and began to study them methodically. Here was a check for $20,000 from the year 2007, the down payment on Edra College. Here's a loan agreement with Quentin dated 2012, $35,000 to buy my first car, which he never paid back. And here are the expenses for Annis's first wedding, from the dress to the hall rental and catering. A phone call interrupted my search. It was Coote. Mr. Rummage, we have a problem. His normally calm voice sounded strained. I just received notice from your daughter's attorney. They've filed a motion for a psychiatric evaluation. I squeezed the receiver of the phone. On what grounds? They claim that your reneging on your promise to pay for the wedding may be a sign of incipient dementia. They have affidavits from several acquaintances and neighbors who allegedly noticed signs of cognitive impairment in you. That's an absolute lie. My voice shook with anger. I know, Coates said soothingly, but the court may grant the motion. In that case, you will have to be evaluated by a court-appointed psychiatrist. And what would that mean for our case? If the examiner confirms your capacity, and I'm sure he will, it will only strengthen our case. But the mere fact that they've taken such a step, it shows how far they're willing to go. After my conversation with Coote, I called my primary care physician, Dr. Nielsen, and asked for an urgent appointment. He agreed to see me the same day. Dr. Nielsen, a short man with a bushy mustache and kind eyes, had been my doctor for 15 years. He listened to my story with professional calm. These are serious allegations, Burrell, he said when I had finished, but medically, they are unfounded. Your recent tests and examinations show no signs of cognitive impairment. Memory, speech, decision-making ability are all normal for your age. Can you give a written opinion on that? Of course, I'll prepare a formal medical report on your medical condition, including mental health. That should help in court. I thanked the doctor and left the clinic with a small sense of relief. At least I would have official medical proof of my legal capacity. Back at home, I continued to sort through my papers. Among them, I found a folder with a power of attorney that I had signed last year before my hospitalization. The pneumonia had been so severe at the time that the doctors hadn't ruled out the worst-case scenario. I wanted to make sure that if something happened to me, someone would be able to pay my bills and manage my finances. Rereading the text of the power of attorney, I noticed the expiration clause. Valid for 6 months from the date of signing or until revoked in writing by the principal. 6 months. I got sick in January, which means the power of attorney expired last July. However, transactions from my account continued after that date. I pulled out my bank statements and scrutinized them again. In August, $5,000 withdrawn. In September, another $7,000. In October, $3,000. And everywhere, Anise Rummage, acting under a power of attorney, was listed as the authorized person. They used an expired power of attorney. That's not just breach of trust, that's fraud. I immediately called Coate and told him of my discovery. "Mr. Rummage, this changes the case," he said, his voice with the excitement of a seasoned hunter who has spotted his prey. "Using an invalid power of attorney to withdraw funds is a criminal offense. We can add that to our counterclaim. And can we prove that the power of attorney was invalid at the time of the transactions?" The power of attorney has a clearly stated expiration date. The bank should have checked that before making the transactions. The fact that they didn't does not absolve your daughter of liability. She knew or should have known that the document was no longer valid. The next day, I went to the bank to find out how the transactions could have been conducted under an invalid power of attorney. The branch manager, Mr. Parker, examined the documents and frowned. "Mr. Rummage, there is a clear breach of procedure here. A copy of the power of attorney is kept on our system and the expiration date should have been noted. I'll check to see which employee handled these transactions." Half an hour later, he returned with a folder. All the transactions were conducted by the same employee, Lily Croft. She was a new employee and may not have paid attention to the expiration date of the power of attorney. Something in his tone made me wary. Or, Parker blinked. Or she could have deliberately ignored that fact. Miss Croft was fired 2 months ago for violating bank procedures in another case. "I need an official letter from the bank confirming that these transactions were made under an invalid power of attorney," I said firmly. "Of course I'll prepare the document. But I must warn you, the bank may be liable for these violations. Management may want to settle the matter without publicity." "I'm not interested in compensation from the bank," I replied. "I want to prove in court that my children knowingly used an invalid power of attorney to embezzle my funds." Returning home with the letter from the bank, I felt strangely devastated. Each new piece of evidence of my children's betrayal was like a knife in my heart. How had we gotten to this point? Where had I gone wrong in raising them? The ringing of the doorbell brought me out of my gloomy thoughts. On the doorstep stood Edra, my youngest daughter. Pale, with circles under her eyes, she looked exhausted. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped back silently, letting her into the house. We made our way to the kitchen where I offered her tea. She sat down at the table, nervously rubbing the sleeve of her sweater. "Dad, I found out about the money Annis and Quentin took out of your account," she finally said. "Is it true?" "Yes, $48,000 in 1 year, on a power of attorney that expired long ago." Edra covered her face with her hands. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "But you knew about the plan to declare me incapacitated so you could gain control of my finances." She didn't answer, and that was more eloquent than any admission. "Why is that, Edra? I've always helped you when I could, paid for your education, gave you money for your business." It's not about the money, she raised flushed eyes at me. Or rather, it's not just about them. Annis and Quentin. They've convinced me that you're becoming self-centered and indifferent to your family. That your refusal to help Annis was just another sign that you no longer cared about us. And you believed it? I didn't know what to think, she admitted. After Mom died, you really changed. Became more withdrawn, called less often, took less interest in our affairs. I grieved, Edra. And yes, I may have become distant. But that doesn't mean I stopped loving you or caring about you. She nodded, looking into her cup. I know now, but Annis is very persuasive when she wants to accomplish something, and Quentin always backs her up. So what now? You're on their side in this lawsuit? Edra shook her head. No, but I won't be on yours either, Dad. I can't choose between you two. I just want to stay out of it. I felt a prick of disappointment. Even after learning the truth, she hadn't found the strength to take my side against my brother and sister. I understand, I said, even though I didn't really understand. It's your choice. I have to go, Edra stood up. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry about what's going on. I walked her to the door. Before she left, she hugged me awkwardly, quickly, as if she was afraid she'd change her mind. Take care of yourself, Dad, she said, and walked quickly away without looking back. Closing the door, I leaned my back against it and closed my eyes. Edra won't take my side. I'm left alone against my own children. In the evening, Lorelei stopped by, bringing freshly baked apple pie. She noticed my mood immediately. What's wrong? Bad news. I told her about the conversation with Edra and my disappointment. You were hoping she'd be supportive, Lorelei asked, pouring the tea. I hoped at least one of my children would do the right thing. Lorelei stirred her tea thoughtfully. You know, sometimes the hardest thing for kids is to admit that their parents might be right and their siblings might be wrong, especially if they've been on the same side all their lives. But they're going to lie in court, Lorelei. They stole my money and now they want to take everything I have. And that's why it's so hard for Edra to accept the truth. To admit that her brother and sister are capable of such a thing is to undo everything she believed about her family. I sighed. Maybe Lorelei was right, but that didn't make it any easier. What does your lawyer say? What are your chances? Coate thinks that evidence of financial fraud with the power of attorney could make a big difference in the outcome of the case, but he worries about how the court will perceive family conflict in general. Judges are often reluctant to get involved in such disputes. What about a psychiatric evaluation? Aren't you afraid? I shook my head. No, Dr. Nielsen gave me a clean bill of health. I passed all the cognitive function tests with excellent results. Lorelei smiled. You've always been smarter than most people half your age. I'm sure the examiner will see that right away. Her encouragement gave me strength. Lorelei was my anchor during these difficult days, reminding me that not everyone in this world is driven by greed and selfishness. The next day, I met with Coate to discuss defense strategy. He was impressed with the documents I had gathered. Mr. Rummage, you've done an excellent job. These statements and receipts clearly show that you have provided significant financial support for your children over the years. And the letter from the bank about the invalid power of attorney is the real bombshell. Do you think the judge will side with us? Coate rubbed his chin. You can never be 100% sure in these cases, but we have a strong position, especially in light of the financial abuse countersuit. What about the psychiatric evaluation? Judge Teddington Yarrow, who will be handling our case, has approved the motion. You'll have to be examined by Dr. Elizabeth Maynard next Tuesday. I nodded. I'm ready. One more piece of news. I don't know if it's good or bad. Your daughter's attorney has offered a settlement again. They've now agreed to $50,000 instead of $90,000. I shook my head. Not a dime. It's not about the money anymore. They tried to cheat me, steal my savings, besmirch my name. I want the truth to come out. Kude nodded understandingly. That's what I thought. Then we continued to prepare for the trial. It will take place in 2 weeks, the 7th of August. On the appointed day, I went to see Dr. Maynard, a serious woman in her 50s with a piercing gaze and a neat tuft of graying hair. She administered the standard battery of tests for memory, attention, reasoning, and other cognitive functions, and asked a host of questions about my life, habits, and relationship with my children. "Mr. Rummage," she said at the end of the 2-hour examination, "I don't see any signs of dementia or other cognitive impairment. Your test scores are above average for your age group. You are perfectly oriented in time and space, have a clear memory and the ability to think logically. And you will state this in your report to the court?" "Absolutely. My job is to give an objective assessment of your condition, and it is unequivocally positive." I left the office with a sense of relief. Another hurdle had been overcome. The final days before trial were spent in intense preparation. Coit and I practiced possible questions and answers, reviewed documents, and discussed strategy. Lorelei helped me mentally, distracting me with talk of books and movies when the anxiety became too much. One evening, as we sat on the veranda watching the sunset, she asked, "Don't you regret going to that conflict? Maybe it would have been easier to just give Annis the money for the wedding." I hesitated. I probably would have done that before. All my life I've tried to avoid confrontation, especially with kids. Gave money when they asked for it, without demanding accountability or gratitude. Maybe that's why they grew up believing they were entitled to my savings. And now you've decided to change the rules of the game. Rather, I've decided that I too have a right to respect and fair treatment, even from my own children, especially from my own children. Lorelei put her hand on mine. "I'm proud of you, Beryl. A lot of people in your shoes would just give up to avoid scandal." "Mabel always said I was too stubborn for my own good," I smiled. Perhaps she was right. Or perhaps your stubbornness is exactly what's needed in a situation like this. The night before the trial, I hardly slept at all. Going over the arguments in my head, remembering the children's faces not as they are now, but as they were when I was a child. Anise, with her pigtails and ringing laughter. Quentin, serious and diligent. Edra, the quiet dreamer with a book in her hands. Where and when did things change? When did money become more important than family ties? When respect and gratitude were replaced by greed and manipulation? There were no answers. There was only the reality that in a few hours I would meet them in a courtroom, not as father and children, but as adversaries in a legal battle. And that thought hurt, despite all my determination. In the morning, I put on my best suit, the dark blue one Mabel had given me for our last anniversary. Tied the tie that Quentin had given me for my birthday once upon a time long ago. A little act of nostalgia that no one but me would appreciate. Lorelei picked me up for a ride to the courthouse. In the car, she noticed my tension. "It's going to be okay, Beryl. The truth is on your side." The truth doesn't always win, Lorelei, especially when there are skillful liars on the other side. But you have documentation, proof. Yes, I clutched the folder of papers. I have proof, and I'm willing to fight to the end. As I drove up to the courthouse, I saw a reporter from the local newspaper with a camera. Apparently, our family drama had already become public. Well, let everyone know the truth. I would no longer hide the betrayal of my own children behind the mask of family prosperity. Coit was waiting out front. Serious, collected, in an impeccable suit, he exuded a confidence I sorely lacked. "Ready, Mr. Rummage?" he asked, shaking my hand. "Ready," I replied, though inside I was clenching from the confrontation ahead. We entered the courthouse and I felt a chill run down my spine. This was going to be the hardest day of my life, but there was no retreat. I had to defend my dignity and protect myself from those I had once cared about most in the world. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. Just a few rows of benches, a judge's desk on a dais, and 2 separate tables for the parties to the trial. Judge Teddington Yarrow had not yet entered, and there was a muffled hum of voices in the room. Coote and I took seats at the right-hand table. I tried not to look toward the opposite table, where Annis and her lawyer, Chase Weber, a young man with perfectly styled hair and a cocky smile, were already seated. Seated next to them were Tristan and Quentin. Edra was nowhere to be seen. She kept her word and didn't show up. "Remember what we discussed," Coote said quietly, spreading out the papers in front of him. "Answer calmly and confidently. Do not give in to provocation. The essence of their strategy is to portray you as an emotionally unstable, forgetful old man. Don't give them that pleasure." I nodded, feeling my mouth go dry. In the public gallery, I spotted Lorelei. She smiled encouragingly at me. A few strangers were sitting next to her, probably neighbors or just curious people attracted by the unusual case. "Stand up, court is in session," announced the bailiff, and everyone rose. Judge Yarrow appeared to be a tall, lean man of about 58, with shrewd dark eyes and a neatly trimmed graying beard. He took his seat and looked around the room with an attentive gaze. "Be seated," he pronounced, and everyone dropped into their seats. "We are considering case number 845-25, Annis Rummage v. Burrell Rummage, a suit to enforce an oral contract, and Burrell Rummage's counterclaim against Annis Rummage and Quentin Rummage for financial malpractice and defamation." The judge invited the parties to come to a compromise, but after negative responses from both sides, gave Weber the floor. Weber stepped to the center of the room and began his speech. "Your Honor, this is a case about a broken promise and how old age can change the person we knew and loved. Miss Annis Rummage, the defendant's daughter, is preparing for the happiest day of her life, her wedding to the man she loves. Naturally, like any daughter, she has turned to her father for help." I noticed Annis fixing her hair and adopting a sad look. Acting talent had always been her forte. Burrell Rummage, a man of considerable savings, promised his daughter to pay the wedding expenses. This promise was made in the presence of several witnesses. Miss Rummage, relying on her father's word, began preparations for the celebration. Suddenly, without any explanation, Mr. Rummage reneged on his promise. Weber paused dramatically and lowered his voice. What made him change his mind? Unfortunately, in recent years, Mr. Rummage's family has noticed a disturbing change in his behavior, forgetfulness, irritability, irrational decisions. We understand that age takes its toll, and we don't blame Mr. Rummage. We only ask the court to order him to fulfill the promise he made to his daughter in a moment of lucidity. Tristan was called as the first witness. After being sworn, he began his testimony. According to him, during a family dinner, I allegedly said, "Of course I will pay for my girl's wedding. It will be my gift to you." "And how did Miss Rummage react to that promise?" Weber asked. "She was very touched and grateful, hugged her father, kissed him on the cheek. It was a very touching moment. Lies. Pure, unadulterated lies. I never said anything like that." "And then what happened? When did Mr. Rummage change his mind?" Tristan sighed with feigned sadness. "It was about a week later. Annis and I went over to his place to discuss the details, and he suddenly said he knew nothing about any promise and wasn't going to spend his money on our wedding." Coote came up for cross-examination and asked some pointed questions about Annis's previous marriages and the lack of evidence of my promise other than the word of witnesses. Quentin was called as the next witness. His testimony echoed Tristan's version, but he added observations about my mental state, claiming that I had become forgetful and sometimes didn't recognize people. Coote ruthlessly questioned him about my recent medical examination, which confirmed full capacity, as well as the financial assistance I was providing him. Then he moved on to the most painful issue of all, power of attorney. Last January, when your father was hospitalized with pneumonia, he signed a power of attorney in your name and your sister Anis's name. Is that correct? Yes, so that we could pay his bills while he was in the hospital. And that power of attorney had an expiration date of 6 months. That is, it expired last July. Are you aware of that? Quentin visibly tensed. I didn't pay attention to the expiration date. You didn't pay attention. However, after the power of attorney expired, another $33,000 was withdrawn from your father's account by someone who identified himself as the trustee. Do you know anything about that? It was a necessary expense for my father. What kind of expenses exactly? Do you have checks? Receipts? I can't remember right now specifically. Coate presented the court with a letter from the bank confirming illegal transactions under an invalid power of attorney, which clearly stunned the prosecution. After a recess, Weber called Anis to the stand. She looked flawless and told a touching story about how important this wedding was to her and how I had allegedly promised to pay for it and then reneged on my word. Cootie began to cross-examine. Miss Rummage, you claim that your father has always supported you. Does that include financial support? Yes, of course. He helped me whenever he could. For example, fully paying for your first wedding. Yes, he did. What about the second one? I paid for the second one myself. From the proceeds of your divorce from your first husband, right? Anis pressed her lips together. It was a legal payoff. Cootie then turned to the issue of power of attorney and illegally withdrawn funds. Anis claimed to have spent the money on my needs but was unable to provide any proof. Coate presented the court with her credit card statement showing that she had made expensive purchases at boutique and jewelry stores at the same time. Your money, or money illegally withdrawn from your father's account? He asked. Anis grew increasingly nervous, and when Cootie presented a printout of her email correspondence with Quentin, discussing a plan to declare me incapacitated after the wedding in order to gain control of my assets, her face contorted with horror. Miss Rummage, is this your correspondence? The judge asked. Anis looked as if she had seen a ghost. Yeah, it could have been a joke. My brother and I sometimes say things like that without meaning anything serious. A joke? Cootie raised an eyebrow. The correspondence discusses in detail which doctor would be willing to give the right opinion, which judge is most favorable to such cases, and how to divide Mr. Rummage's assets after gaining control of them. Quite a detailed joke, don't you think? Anis was silent, lowering her eyes. Her hands were trembling. Then it was my turn to testify. I stated firmly that I had never promised to pay for Anis's wedding, told of my financial support for the children over the years, and how I had discovered the illegal withdrawals from my account. The final witness was Lorelei, who confirmed my clarity of mind and recounted how I shared with her concerns about the children's strange behavior. In closing argument, Coate emphasized, Your Honor, this case began as a simple oral promise dispute, but in the course of the proceedings, we discovered something much more serious, a systematic attempt by Mr. Rummage's children to gain control of his finances through deception and manipulation. First, they illegally used an expired power of attorney to embezzle funds. Then they spread false information about his mental state. And finally, they planned to declare him incapacitated after the wedding in order to gain complete control of his assets. Weber, in his closing argument, tried to shift the focus to the emotional side, on the broken family relationships and Anis's unfulfilled hopes for a perfect wedding. But his argument sounded unconvincing in the face of the evidence we have presented. Judge Yarrow announced that he would rule in 3 days and close the hearing. As I left the courtroom, I happened to meet Anis's eyes. Her eyes were filled with fear, not for our relationship, not for the wedding, but for the consequences of revealing her machinations. For the first time, I saw the real her, calculating and frightened at the same time. Quentin stared at the floor, avoiding my gaze, and Tristan kept his distance from Annis, as if he was already reconsidering his decision to commit to her. "You held up great," Coit said as we stepped outside. "I think the judge is on our side." "What now?" I asked, feeling a strange emptiness inside. Winning in court wouldn't bring my kids back, wouldn't undo the betrayal. "Now we wait for the decision, and then you'll decide if you want to pursue the criminal prosecution for financial mismanagement." I shook my head. "I don't want to see my children behind bars. I just want them to leave me alone." Lorelei walked over and took me under her arm. "Let's go home, Beryl. You look exhausted." We walked in silence to the car, leaving behind the courthouse where the most painful scene of my life had just played out. The judge's decision was ahead, but I knew by now that my family as I knew it no longer existed. The 3 days of waiting for the court's decision dragged on interminably. I tried to occupy myself with the usual chores, reading the weather logs, recording the barometer readings, working in the garden, but my thoughts kept returning to the court, to the faces of my children, to the documents that revealed their true intentions. I slept badly, waking several times a night. Lorelei stopped by every day, bringing homemade baked goods, telling me the city news, trying to distract me with talk of books and movies. I was grateful for her support, though I often caught myself not listening to her, immersed in my own dark thoughts. "What are you thinking about, Beryl?" she asked on the eve of the announcement of the decision, as we sat on the veranda with cups of tea. "About how we got to this point," I answered honestly. "Where did I go wrong in raising the children? Why did they grow up so calculating?" Lorelei looked wistfully up at the setting sky. "You know, when I taught literature, we often discussed with the students the motives behind the characters' actions, and I always told them that a human being is a complex being, shaped by many factors, not just upbringing." "Are you saying it's not my fault?" "I'm saying you shouldn't torture yourself by looking for a single cause. You were a good father, caring, generous. What your children grew up to be is the result of a lot of circumstances, including their own choices." I sighed. "Maybe you're right. But that doesn't make it any easier." On the day the verdict was announced, I wore the same dark blue suit I'd worn on the first day of court. Cootie picked me up to go to court together. "How are you feeling?" he asked as we drove through the morning streets of Pearland. "Nervous," I admitted. "Not because of the decision. I'm sure the truth is on our side. But because of the fact that today may be the day that the bond with my children is finally severed." Cootie nodded understandingly. Family conflicts are always the most painful, especially when they're brought out into the public space. An unexpectedly large number of people had gathered in front of the courthouse. I recognized a few neighbors, a reporter from the local newspaper, even a couple of former colleagues from the weather service. News of our trial had apparently spread through the city. In the courtroom, we took the same seats as the first day. Annis and Quentin sat at the opposite table, avoiding looking in my direction. Tristan was seated on the public bench, keeping a noticeable distance from his fiancée. I wonder, I thought, if they'd had time to talk since the email was revealed. Lorelei sat in the front row of the audience directly behind me. Her presence energized me. "All rise, court is in session," the bailiff announced, and everyone rose. Judge Yarrow entered and took his seat. His face was impenetrable, as a judge should be before pronouncing judgment. "Be seated," he said, and everyone dropped into their seats. "I have reviewed the entire case file, listened to the witnesses, and am ready to rule in case number 845, fraction 25, Annis Rummage v. Beryl Rummage." There was complete silence in the hall. I felt Lorelei gently touch my shoulder in a gesture of encouragement. In the action of Annis Ramage against Beryl Ramage to enforce an oral contract, the claim is to be dismissed in its entirety. I heard Anise exhale sharply, and Weber whispered something in her ear. On the counterclaim of Burrell Rumridge against Annis Rumridge and Quentin Rumridge for financial malpractice and defamation, the claims are granted in part. Judge Yarrow paused, turned the page of his notes, and continued. That the actions of defendants Annis Ramage and Quentin Ramage in using an invalid power of attorney to withdraw funds from the plaintiff's account be found to be wrongful. To order Annis Rumridge and Quentin Rumridge to jointly and severally reimburse Burrell Rumridge for $33,000 wrongfully withdrawn from his account, plus interest for the use of the funds in the amount of $3,842. I saw Quentin go pale. For him, who was constantly in financial difficulty, this was a serious blow. That the defendant's actions in disseminating false information about the plaintiff's mental state be declared libelous and that they be ordered to make a public apology in writing to the plaintiff. To oblige the defendants to reimburse the plaintiff for the costs of representative services in the amount of $8,500 and court costs in the amount of $1,200. In part of the claims for compensation for moral harm, to refuse due to insufficient evidence of the amount of moral suffering caused. Judge Yarrow paused once more, looked around the room, and added, I would like to point out that the materials of this case, in terms of the use of an invalid power of attorney, contain signs of a criminal offense, fraud. The injured party has the right to apply to law enforcement authorities to initiate criminal proceedings. The court decision shall come into force in 30 days. The session is declared closed. The knock of the judge's gavel sounded like the final chord of our family drama. The first minutes after the decision was announced passed like a blur. Cootie shook my hand, congratulating me on my victory. Lorelei hugged me, whispering in my ear, "Justice has been done." Several acquaintances came up to show their support. I watched as Annis and Quentin hurried out of the courtroom, surrounded by reporters. Annis covered her face with her purse, and Quentin waved away questions. Tristan sat on the bench, staring into space with a lost look. "Mr. Rumage," Coot interrupted my observations, "do you wish to make a statement to the press?" I shook my head. "No, I just want to go home." "I see. As for the criminal case, you still don't plan to initiate it?" "No. A civil suit is enough for me. Let them return the money and pay compensation. That's enough." Coot nodded understandingly. "As you say. Then we'll prepare documents to enforce the court's judgment. As soon as it comes into effect, we'll start the collection process." As Lorelei and I walked out of the courthouse, Tristan caught up with us. He looked pale and drained, like a man who hadn't slept in several nights. "Mr. Rumage, can I talk to you for a minute?" I nodded, and we stepped away from the reporters. "I want to apologize for my involvement in all of this," he began, nervously rubbing his tie. "I really didn't know how far Annis had gone in her plans. That correspondence about declaring you incompetent. I was shocked." "You perjured yourself under oath," I reminded him. He lowered his eyes. "Yes, and I'm not proud of it. Anise convinced me that it was the only way to get the money for the wedding, that you were just being stubborn but actually wanted to help. And you believed her?" "I loved her, or thought I did," he grinned bitterly. "You know, after the trial, she didn't even talk to me. Went straight off with Quentin, discussing how they'd pay the compensation. Not a word about our future, about getting married. I had no sympathy for him, but there was no gloating either. Just fatigue and a desire to end this conversation." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Break off the engagement. I can't marry a man I don't trust, who, as it turns out, I don't know." He held out his hand to me. "Again, I apologize for everything. I was a fool." I shook his hand, feeling oddly relieved that at least one person in this story had the strength to admit a mistake. At home, the first thing I did was take a hot shower, change into my home clothes, and sit by the window with a cup of strong tea. A strange feeling of desolation and liberation filled me at the same time. The battle had been won, but at what cost? The ringing of the doorbell interrupted my musings. On the threshold stood Edra, my youngest daughter. Pale, with reddened eyes, she looked like she had been crying. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped back silently, letting her into the house. We walked to the living room where I offered her tea. She declined and sat on the edge of the couch, nervously clutching her purse. "I know about the court order," she began. "Annis called me right after the hearing. She's hysterical." "No wonder," I replied dryly. "Dad, I came to apologize for not taking your side when you needed support, for doubting you." I looked at her carefully. There was remorse in her eyes, but there was something else too. Calculation? Fear? It was hard to tell. "Why now, Edra? Why not before, when your brother and sister were planning on ripping me off?" She lowered her eyes. "I was afraid. Annis and Quentin have always been stronger, more confident. I was used to following them without hesitation. And then, I really didn't know how far they'd gone. That correspondence about declaring you incompetent is horrible. But you knew about the illegally withdrawn money, and you kept quiet." "Yes," she raised reddened eyes to me. "And I have no excuse. I can only apologize and hope that in time you can trust me again." I sighed. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to believe in the sincerity of her remorse, but another part remembered how she refused to support me when I needed it most. "Edra, you are my daughter, and I will always love you. But trust is something that has to be earned, and you've shown me that I can't count on you in a time of need." "I understand," she nodded, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "But I want to make things right. Give me a chance, Dad." "Time will tell," I replied after a pause. "Right now, I need to be alone to make sense of everything that's happened." Edra stood up. "I understand, but know that I'm here if you need anything, and I won't let Annis and Quentin manipulate me anymore." When she left, I sat in silence for a long time, trying to sort out my feelings. Was Edra being sincere? Or was this another maneuver, now on her part, to ensure her access to my finances after Annis and Quentin had failed? In the evening, Lorelei came in with a bottle of good wine and ingredients for dinner. "I thought you might not feel like cooking after a day like this," she said as she made her way into the kitchen. "And an empty stomach is a bad counselor in hard times." While she prepared dinner, a simple but flavorful risotto with mushrooms, I told her about Tristan and Edra's visits. "What do you think?" I asked when I finished the story. "Is Edra really repentant, or is this just another manipulation?" Lorelei hesitated, stirring her risotto. "Perhaps a little of both. People rarely act out of one pure motive. Maybe she's genuinely sorry for her inaction, but also afraid of remaining isolated when Annis and Quentin have lost your trust." "You mean I shouldn't close the door completely to her?" "I think you can give her a chance to prove the sincerity of her remorse, but at the same time, keep an emotional distance until you're sure of her motives." We ate dinner on the veranda, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon, coloring the sky in shades of pink and gold. The wine was excellent, the risotto was delicious, and the company was the nicest possible. "You know what I'm thinking?" Lorelei said as we moved on to dessert. "Fresh berries and cream. About our conversation last fall, about our trip to Europe." I smiled, remembering. Indeed, we'd fantasized about traveling through small towns in France and Italy, tasting local wines, visiting museums and ancient castles. "Do you think now would be a good time?" "Why wouldn't it be?" She shrugged. "The trial is over. You'll get your money back. You deserve a vacation and new experiences after all you've been through." I wondered. The idea was tempting. Get away from Pearland for a while, leave the painful memories behind, see new places. "You know, you're right. Maybe that's exactly what I need right now." "Then it's settled." Lorelei glared. "I'll start researching itineraries and hotels." We could start with Provence, I suggested, feeling myself being taken over by the idea. It's just lavender season there, and then move toward Tuscany. We spent the rest of the evening discussing the details of the trip, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly encouraged. Perhaps this trial, for all its painfulness, was a necessary step. It freed me from toxic relationships, guilt, and obligations to those who didn't appreciate my love or my help. The following weeks passed in preparation for the trip. Lorelai and I booked hotels, researched attractions, and planned our itinerary. This activity so engrossed both of us that I hardly thought about the trial and its consequences. Annis and Quentin never showed up or called. I learned from Coit that they had made the first payment of $10,000 in compensation. They promised to pay the rest within a year. They published a public apology in the local newspaper, dry, formal lines, obviously drafted by a lawyer. Edra called several times inquiring about my health, offering to help around the house. I was polite but reserved. The wound was still too fresh for me to fully open up to her. The day before we left for Europe, she came to say goodbye and brought a small gift, a book on French cooking. "I heard about your trip with Lorelai," she said, handing me the package. "I hope you have a great time." "Thank you, Edra." I accepted the gift, touched by her attention. "I'll send postcards." "Dad, I know you're not ready to fully forgive me yet," she spoke softly but firmly. "And I realize that I've let you down. But I want you to know that I love you and I'll wait as long as it takes to regain your trust." I hugged her, feeling genuinely close for the first time in a long time. "I love you too, Edra. And I believe that in time we can build a new, healthy relationship." The next morning, Lorelai and I got into a cab headed for the airport. I looked back at my house, the neat garden, the swing on the veranda. 3 months I wouldn't be here. 3 months of new experiences, new places, new opportunities. "What are you thinking about?" Lorelai asked, noticing my thoughtfulness. "About how sometimes the end is just the beginning of something new," I replied, squeezing her hand. The cab pulled away, taking us away from Pearland, away from the past, away from painful memories. There was a new phase of life ahead of us, one without toxic relationships, without manipulation, without betrayal, a stage where I could be myself without fear of being judged or used. I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Perhaps the trial was not an end, but a liberation. The beginning of a new journey where I am surrounded only by those who truly care about me, who see me not as a wallet but as a human being. And even though my family will never be the same again, I will create a new one based on mutual respect and sincere affection. Lorelai smiled at me, and I smiled back, looking not back, but forward to a future that now belonged only to me.